Mass cull begins amid bird flu scare. Family food at Sononkai properties coming to an end. And Japan angers its neighbours in territorial disputes.
Good evening. The government has started to cull 20,000 chickens at the Changsha poultry temporary wholesale market after samples from across the border tested positive for the H7N9 virus. Secretary for Food and Health, Ko Wing-man, says Hong Kong authorities are waiting for their mainland counterparts to confirm the source of the infection. Stephanie Choi begins our coverage.
The threat of an avian flu outbreak looms once again, and these government officers at the Changsha market were there to try to minimize the risk. First to go among the 20,000 birds here, a batch of chickens from Foshan. Some chickens in the batch have tested positive for the H7N9 virus. The birds were put into bins and gassed with carbon dioxide, then into the bags and buried in the landfill. Workers from the Agriculture, Fisheries and Conservation Department and the Food and Environmental Hygiene Department got here at around 10:30 this morning to cull and take away close to 11,000 live poultry on this side of the wholesale market. As you can see here behind me, some of the carcasses have already been put into garbage bags. The government says it will offer a compensation of $30 to poultry farmers for each bird culled, and it's tracing those who might have come into contact with the infected birds. These include customs officers at the Mankamto border checkpoint, Food and Environmental Hygiene Department officers in charge of testing the birds, and anyone at the wholesale market who might have handled them. They will all be under medical observation for signs of avian flu. The driver of a lorry that brought the birds here is already under isolation at Princess Margaret Hospital. The government has refused to name the farm in Foshan in Guangdong province where the infected birds came from, and mainland authorities are trying to trace the exact source of infection. Residents living near the suspected farm in Shunde say they have seen dead chickens there. They speculate the carcasses are incinerated or buried if nobody comes to collect them. But mainland authorities say they drop by the farm every day to see if its owners disinfect the place and administer vaccines for their poultry, and conclude that the farm meets health standards. Stephanie Choi, TVB News.
Meanwhile, local chicken vendors are crying foul. They say the government needs to take full responsibility for the discovery of the virus. They have called for alternatives to better safeguard their business. More on that from Rachel Leung.
A 3-week ban on live poultry has sparked anger among chicken vendors who were expecting brisk business during the Lunar New Year. They staged a protest outside the central government offices today, stressing that chickens raised locally are safe. Secretary for Food and Health Ko Wing-man met with members of the local chicken trade to discuss issues relating to the suspension. They accused the government of failing to stop mainland poultry from entering Hong Kong until they were confirmed to be clear of the bird flu virus. They also proposed suggestions to prevent infected birds from being brought into the city again. Choi Ming-chin, chairman of a Chamber of Commerce for the live poultry trade, wants imported birds to be kept at the border area for at least 4 hours after arriving in Hong Kong. And only when their avian flu test results prove negative should they be allowed to enter the city. Representatives also want a separate market for the trading of locally produced birds to prevent cross-contamination. But the health chief appears cool to the idea.
There are genuine technical difficulty in identifying a suitable place for such a purpose. And on top of that, even if we come up with a possible position or site for such purpose, we anticipate resistance or objection from various districts.
Still, lawmaker Stephen Ho of the agriculture and fisheries sector said the meeting with Ko went well. He pointed out that the government will calculate the losses faced by vendors and compensate them accordingly. Wholesaler Regal Jiang has about 70,000 market-ready birds in 7 farms across Hong Kong. He was hoping to sell about 40% of them over the Lunar New Year period. Jiang said the 3-week ban on live poultry sale because of avian flu is going to cost him more than $10 million. Jiang says his farm will eventually run out of space because of all the chickens that are forced to stay here during the 21-day sales ban. And by that time, he will have no choice but to kill some of them. Rachel Ling, TVB News.
Well, the chief executive has called for a rethink on the consumption of live poultry in Hong Kong. And there are fresh calls to consider a permanent ban on the live poultry trade here. Gerard Silva with that story.
Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying thinks it's time for Hong Kong to break with tradition as far as its demand for fresh chicken meat is concerned. He said Hong Kong needs to reconsider its habit of consuming live poultry during the festive season.
This is the 5th time that we have picked up a positive sample in the last 17 years, since 1997, and therefore the Secretary for Health announced a series of measures according to the existing policies.
Besides losses for chicken vendors, it's a headache for cooks like this one. What shall I serve instead of chicken during the Lunar New Year, she asks. These women suggest using eggs or pork for ancestor worship when they would normally use a freshly cooked chicken. Chilled chicken is an alternative for those who simply must have chicken on the menu, and it costs much less than fresh meat. But that eats into the profit of shops. And as far as public health is concerned, experts warn that live birds in local markets pose a serious threat to public health.
This H7N9 is different from the other avian influenza virus. Firstly, it has the potential to spread from animal to human, and not only from animal to human, there is increasing evidence it can spread from contaminated environment to human. That means people without direct contact with the animal could acquire the infection from exposure to wet market. We should be revisiting the question of a permanent ban of the live poultry trade in Hong Kong as soon as possible.
Dr. Ho adds that live poultry infected with the H7N9 avian influenza virus is a particularly dangerous kind of threat because infected birds do not show signs of sickness and because even the top-notch testing technology used here in Hong Kong is not 100% effective in detecting the virus. João Silva, TV News.
To other news, a deal announced by Sun Hung Kai Properties may have now marked the end of a long-standing dispute among members of the Kwok family that controls the property giant. Former chairman Walter Kwok has stepped down as a non-executive director. The statement also said he and his family received the same entitlement to shares in the company as his 2 brothers, Raymond and Thomas, and their families. That restores Walter Kwok as a beneficiary of the family trust. He was ousted as chairman back in 2008 and later removed as a beneficiary of the trust. Raymond and Thomas Kwok currently serve as joint chairman of Sun Hung Kai Properties.
China says it's lodged a protest against Japan's revision of its teaching manuals to lay claim to disputed islands in the East China Sea. Earlier today, Japan's education minister said the decision was made to reflect the government's official view on territorial disputes with China and South Korea. He said the current manuals don't mention the island chain called Senkakus by Japan and the Diaoyus by China and rocky islets known as Dokdo in Korea and Takeshima in Japan. The revision is seen as part of education reform by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's government. The foreign ministry in Beijing responded angrily, urging Tokyo to stop provocations. It's just the latest in a string of incidents that have strained relations between the 2 countries.
Thailand's government has announced it will go ahead with parliamentary elections this Sunday, despite street protests and an opposition boycott. Thailand's Deputy Prime Minister made the announcement today after a meeting between caretaker Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra and the Election Commission, which sought a delay in the polls. Yingluck attended the meeting despite a blockade around the venue by anti-government protesters pushing for her resignation before any polls are held. Protesters want Yingluck replaced by a non-elected interim government that would institute reforms to fight corruption. The demonstrators have said they will continue their action regardless. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych has agreed to scrap harsh anti-protest laws that set off a wave of clashes between police and demonstrators over the past week. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mykola Azarov submitted his resignation today as the Ukrainian parliament started an emergency session over the protests. He says he hopes his move could help the country's political crisis. Ellen Buckner reports.
Yanukovych met with opposition leaders again yesterday as the standoff between police and demonstrators continued outside. He's been under increasing pressure to step down and call an election. Following the meeting, one of the opposition leaders, boxer-turned-politician Vitaly Klitschko, said none of the opposition accepted offers of cabinet positions from Yanukovych. And in a possible major sticking point, a proposed amnesty for arrested protesters would not be offered unless anti-government demonstrators stopped occupying government offices and ended their round-the-clock occupation of Kiev's Independence Square. For the second time in a week, U.S. Vice President Joe Biden spoke with President Yanukovych by phone, calling for the protesters' grievances to be addressed and offering U.S. mediation for the talks. He also warned against declaring a state of emergency. Ukraine's foreign minister said later that the introduction of a state of emergency is not being considered.
The introduction of the state of emergency is a very complicated procedure. It should go firstly through the National Security and Defense Council, through the presidential endorsement and adoption by the parliament. And today, this matter is not on the table.
Kozhara said international mediators weren't necessary for the talks at the moment, but didn't rule out the possibility. The demonstrations have been going on since November, when Yanukovych scrapped a free trade deal with the European Union in favor of building closer ties with Russia. Alan Buckney, TVB News.
And coming up after the break, police accuse a man of stealing 2 vehicles. The Sochi Olympic flame reaches volatile Dagestan. And remembering American folk legend and activist Pete Seeger.